Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides and our continuing coverage of the appreciation, remembrance, and reflections on our 39th president, Jimmy Carter. On our thanks to Nora O'Donnell, our team of correspondents, presidential biographers of Jimmy Carter's presidency, associates, even the Secret Service detail who traveled with him as former President Carter, all offering their perspectives this long afternoon as here in Washington, D.C., the process of honoring, remembering, and in a bipartisan way, assembling here in Washington to pay tribute to the 39th President of the United States. To summarize the day right now, as you can see, in the Capitol Rotunda, former President Carter is lying in state, a military guard of honor around him. His body arrived in Washington this afternoon, stopping briefly at the Navy Memorial. Why? Because former President Carter was the first and only American president to be a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Later this evening and all day tomorrow, the general public will be allowed into the Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects. And just a short time ago, lawmakers, both parties, took part in a memorial for former President Carter. Carter's funeral service, as Nora just mentioned as she closed out the CBS News special report, will be held Thursday, the National Cathedral, before his remains are flown back to Georgia for burial. I want to start tonight with Megan Hayes and Mara Gillespie. Megan served as Director of Message Planning for the Biden administration. Mara previously served as an advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Megan, let me just start with you, and Mara, I'll ask you the same question. Global thoughts on President Carter and post-President Carter.
I think that his post-presidency probably said more than his presidency did. I think that he set a tone for how presidents should be able to live their post-life. He did incredible things in his legacy, and I think that he is the perfect example of a legacy being some good and some bad, and really being able to see that. And I think it's really great, as we were talking earlier during the break, that half our country wasn't alive when President Carter was president. And so for people and young people to be able to see all of the impact that he made post-presidency, I think is really great in these tribute services.
Mara, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that for many of us, we view him as the humanitarian. You know, we view his work with Habitat for Humanity, but also his humility, his humble beginnings, his long relationship with Rosalind Carter, his wife, that long marriage. I mean, 77 years. Mm-hmm. That is astounding to so many of us. And so I think we view it in that lens, but we would be remiss not to look at his legacy as president and those first years before he really built his legacy of humanitarian legacy. You know, he was interfering in ways, post-presidency with foreign affairs and making life difficult for George H.W. Bush and getting involved in foreign matters. And so there is that part of his legacy that we can't necessarily forget. But in a moment like today, we look at the humanitarian and the life overall of Jimmy Carter.
Megan and Moore, I also want you to evaluate former President Carter in this sense, because I do believe he is an important first in our modern political orientation toward the presidency. The first true outsider who ran as an identified outsider, who was not, in his words, tainted by too much experience in Washington or the shell game of Washington or the give and take in Washington. He was not the first. He began an entire process of people campaigning for the presidency as outsiders. The only exception to that is George Herbert Walker Bush. Every other one, even Ronald Reagan ran as a kind of outsider. Bill Clinton ran as an outsider. Certainly Barack Obama did. George W. Bush did. And I think the absolute ringleader of outsiderism would be Donald Trump. And then President Biden would be an institutionalist in between that as well.
But he also ran as an outsider, right? They called him Scranton Joe. And also, he was the first person, President Biden was the first person to endorse Jimmy Carter.
Back in 1976.
Exactly. So, it's an interesting, and if you listen to some of Carter's speeches and some of the things that President Biden says now about being more optimistic than you have been before and thinking more for America than what we have right now, they have a lot of parallels. And it's really interesting to sort of see the parallels in their presidencies and some of how their legacy is going to play out. So I do think, he did set the tone and he did show a way to run as an outsider and show that average people and normal people can be the president, whether or not it was accepted at the time. I think it's much more accepted now than it probably was when Carter did it.
Outsiderism began with Jimmy Carter, right, Maura? Sort of?
I think that the pendulum just swings, and that just shows us what our electorate does. There was all the Nixon drama. And so looking at an outsider was, if we need to get away from the establishment and what's happening in D.C., let's get an outsider. And then the pendulum swung back, right? And we saw it happen with Trump and then Biden. And so, yes, if he ran as Scranton Joe, but reality was that we had an outsider who did not do the best job. And in both situations, they wanted to go for somebody who had a little more meat behind them, if you will. And so I think that there is this idea that we wanted a little more stability at a certain time of our history, and that's what we chose who we chose. And if we weren't happy with certain aspects, like the economy or whatever it may have been, then we chose somebody else based on those issues. It comes back down just to issues and what's happening in the United States at that moment or in the world at that moment. It's not necessarily always the person themselves.
Megan,
Exactly.
It struck me that this may be one of the last times we see formal public remarks from Vice President Kamala Harris before the exiting of the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. She noted accomplishments from her vantage point of the Carter presidency, creation of the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, FEMA, clean energy initiatives, and judicial appointments. For most Democrats looking back on Jimmy Carter, are those the greatest hits?
I mean, I think so, but I think that most Democrats are looking back on his humanitarian efforts post-presidency. I do think, he did play a lot. In the Panama Canal, there's some other foreign policy things, good and bad foreign policy things that he did, also appointing so many judges. He appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which was a longstanding in our Supreme Court. So I do think that, yes, and he had more women, I think, than anyone else had appointed into his administration. So there are some things that have now been eclipsed as modern times have taken over. But, I think we just go back to Jimmy Carter's legacy is really his post-presidency and his humanitarian efforts and what he did post-presidency, and I think that is what people are going to really hold their hat on with him.
Maura, your last thoughts?
I think Democrats would be wise to do that and not focus on what he did during his presidency because he wasn't very popular. And in those early years, directly after, I think some of his advisors said, well, he forgot he wasn't president. I would hate for that to be repeated in the future for any presidents who forget that they're no longer president. I think that we would be best, and Democrats would be best served by focusing on the humanitarian aspect for sure.
The last word, Maura Gillespie and Megan Hayes. Thanks so very much. We appreciate it. President-elect Donald Trump spoke at Mar-a-Lago this afternoon after Congress certified his election win. We're tracking some of the latest developments from the transition, including efforts on the Trump legal team's behalf to stop Special Counsel Jack Smith's final report from being published. Some of that's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. There was a fair amount of legal wrangling while Donald Trump was pursuing the Republican nomination and legal wrangling after he secured the Republican Party's nomination. That's an understatement. Well, as we approach his inauguration date on January 20th, still more legal wrangling, and I'm going to describe it now. Stick with me. This one, even by those standards that we've grown accustomed to, highly complex. So today, a federal judge temporarily blocked the release of Special Counsel Jack Smith's report on President-elect Trump. Judge Eileen Cannon, who we should note Trump appointed to the federal bench in his first term, ruled that a federal appeals court must make a decision on this matter before it can proceed in any way, shape, or form. This is part of a lawsuit by President-elect Trump's former co-defendants in the documents case. Smith says his team is finalizing a 2-volume report on its now defunct investigations into Trump, which included the documents at Mar-a-Lago subject to an FBI raid under a search warrant. The president-elect's lawyers got themselves involved in this because they're asking the Attorney General not to release this report, and they're doing so not only on behalf of the former president, but his co-defendants. I think I summarized that somewhat well. Scott McFarland, who joins us now from Capitol Hill, will let me know if I did or didn't. Scott?
Oh, Major, you nailed it. But this really is like one of those TV shows you sit down to binge watch, and your husband or wife says, I've lost the plot. Where is this story going? There is a fundamental direction this story is going. Trump and his prior co-defendants in that classified records case don't want you to read what Jack Smith is ready to release. His findings, required under special counsel law, in his investigation. Special counsels do this over the years. They release it to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General can release it to the public. You know when we last saw an episode of that show? When Bob Mueller reported to the Attorney General, Bill Barr, his findings on the Trump investigation, Ukraine and Russia. It gets released to the public. There are clearly limited days left for Jack Smith and Attorney General Merrick Garland to do this, 13 days to be exact. Trump and his co-defendants are trying to hit that snooze button, stall out that clock some more, and they have. They've got the district judge in Florida, Eileen Cannon, a Trump appointee, who dismissed that classified records case on July 15th to kick this thing to an appeals court and delay the clock. The appeals court decides next, and we could, Major, have a filing tomorrow morning from Jack Smith or the Justice Department arguing why this thing should be released for all to see.
Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill, where there is not one snooze button in arm's length. Thank you, sir. President-elect Trump held, well, this is one way to describe it, a wide-ranging press conference at Mar-a-Lago today. He talked about pardons for January 6th defendants, at least ones he's considering, possibly taking over Greenland, and even renaming the Gulf of Mexico as, quote, the Gulf of America, unquote. Caitlin Huey-Burns was there and joins us now from West Palm Beach, Florida. Other observations from you, Caitlin, based on all of the varied answers from the president-elect?
Well, Major, a lot of items I didn't have on my bingo card going into this press conference this morning at Mar-a-Lago. Covered a range of issues, as you mentioned. But the biggest highlight, the biggest takeaway, the biggest headline from today is that Donald Trump would not rule out the use of military force potentially to take over the Panama Canal and to take over Greenland. Let's start with Greenland. We know since over the past few years, he has flirted with the idea, has talked about the idea of trying to buy Greenland. Greenland, of course, is a territory of Denmark. Denmark has made very clear that it is not for sale, but that hasn't stopped the president-elect from toying with the idea. He says it's of national security interest. He also wants the U.S. to take over the Panama Canal, which it essentially gave away its operational rights to back in 1999. But not ruling out the use of military force here in both of those cases was a big headline. And Major, I also asked, since we are, of course, this comes after the day after January 6th, yesterday, when Congress certified Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 presidential race. I also asked for more specifics about the kinds of pardons he says he's going to issue on day one of his presidency for January 6th defendants. Remember, there are nearly 1,600 people who have been charged in relation to that riot on the Capitol that day, and about 170 of them charged with violent criminal offenses. So I asked President Trump, president-elect, if he wants to pardon, if he's planning on pardoning those who were charged with violent offenses on that day. And he really didn't rule that out either. He said that he's looking at everything and he's going to have big pardons coming on that first day in office.
And what, if anything, did the president-elect say about immigration and his intentions there, Caitlin?
As you know, Major, immigration was key to his victory. He has said as much today. And I asked, how he is planning on using executive order versus how he wants Congress to handle this. Remember, we've been talking about how Congress is going to handle his agenda, whether it's one big bill through reconciliation or broken up into two bills or perhaps multiple bills. So I asked, how much can you do through executive order and how much do you want Congress to act on immigration, given that it's his priority? And he essentially said that in his first administration, he did a lot on immigration on his own and plans to do it again this time.
Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you for that summary. We appreciate it very, very much. That does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern, the Daily Report. That starts right now.